She raised her daughter alone for 23 years. Through poverty, through shame, through every storm life threw at her. She worked 3 jobs, starved so her child could eat, and sacrificed everything just to see that girl smile. But on her daughter's wedding day, she was stopped at the church door. The security guard handed her a note from her own child, a note that said she wasn't welcome, that she was too poor, too embarrassing, too unworthy to be seen at such an elegant ceremony. But what nobody knew, not the groom, not the guests, not even the bride, was the truth this mother had carried for 23 years. A truth that, once revealed, would silence the entire church. A truth that would turn the wedding upside down. A truth that would make everyone ask, how did a mother's greatest sacrifice become her daughter's deepest shame? To understand this, we need to go back to the day Helen became a widow at 25. Where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments. Helen Mensah was 25 years old when her husband Daniel died in a car accident, leaving her pregnant and alone. They'd been married for only 2 years, barely enough time to build a life together, and suddenly she was a widow with a baby on the way and nothing but Daniel's debts to inherit. Daniel's family blamed her for his death. He was driving to meet you when the accident happened. His mother had said coldly at the funeral, if you hadn't called him, demanding he come home early, he'd still be alive. It wasn't true. Daniel had been driving home from work, his normal route at his normal time. But grief needs a target, and Helen was convenient. You're not welcome in this family anymore, Daniel's older brother Joseph declared after the funeral. You brought bad luck to our brother. We don't want you around. Helen's own family wasn't much better. Her father had died when she was young, and her mother had remarried a man who'd never liked Helen. You should have stayed married longer before getting pregnant, her stepfather said. Now you're damaged goods. No man will want you with another man's child. So Helen found herself truly alone. 25 years old, pregnant, widowed, and rejected by both families. She had no education beyond secondary school, no savings, and no support system. But she had something else. She had fierce determination, because the baby growing inside her was all she had left of Daniel, and she would die before she let her child suffer. Helen gave birth to a daughter she named Grace. Because you are grace in the middle of grief, she whispered to the tiny baby. You are the blessing that came from loss. Life as a young widow with a baby was brutally hard. Helen worked as a housemaid during the day, cleaned offices at night, and sold food on weekends. She lived in a tiny single room in one of Lagos's poorest neighborhoods. The room was barely big enough for a bed and a small cooking area, but it was hers, and she kept it immaculately clean. Grace grew up watching her mother work constantly. Helen would leave before dawn and return after dark, exhausted but always with a smile for her daughter. She'd cook whatever small meal she could afford, help Grace with homework by candlelight when there was no electricity, and tell her stories about her father. Your daddy was brilliant, Helen would say. He was studying to be an engineer. He had big dreams. And you have his intelligence, Grace. You're going to do amazing things. Grace was a bright child, curious and ambitious. She did well in the small primary school Helen managed to afford, and as she grew older, her academic abilities became obvious. She was top of her class year after year. But being the daughter of a poor widow came with social stigma. Other children teased Grace about her patched uniforms and worn shoes. Parents whispered about Helen, speculating about whether she was really a widow or just an unmarried mother using widow as a cover story. "Why do people say bad things about you, Mama?" 8-year-old Grace asked one day after a particularly cruel incident at school. Helen knelt down to her daughter's level. "Because people judge what they don't understand. They see a young widow and assume the worst. But their opinions don't define us, Grace. Our actions do. And as long as we live with integrity, hold our heads high, and work hard, we'll be fine. But it hurts when they talk." "I know, baby. It hurts me too. But pain makes us stronger. Remember that." When Grace was 12, she won a scholarship to a prestigious secondary school. It was a huge achievement, but it came with a challenge. The school required uniforms, books and supplies that Helen couldn't afford, even with the scholarship covering tuition. Helen took on a fourth job. She started doing laundry for wealthy families, carrying heavy loads on her head from house to house. Her back ached constantly, her hands became rough and calloused. But she made sure Grace had everything she needed. Grace thrived at the new school. She was brilliant in mathematics and science, winning competitions and earning praise from teachers. But she was also increasingly aware of the class differences between herself and her classmates. Most of her peers came from wealthy families. They were dropped off in nice cars, had drivers and housekeepers, took vacations abroad. Grace arrived on public transport, wearing a uniform her mother had sewn by hand from second-hand fabric, carrying books her mother had borrowed and photocopied because she couldn't afford to buy them new. "Why are we so poor, Mama?" teenage Grace asked one evening, frustrated after another day of feeling less than her classmates. Helen looked at her daughter with tired eyes. "We're not poor, Grace. We're struggling. There's a difference. Poor is a state of mind. Struggling is a temporary situation. We're working our way up. But you work so hard. Why doesn't it get better?" "Because I'm investing in you. Every naira I earn goes into your future, your education, your food, your shelter. I could work less if I gave you less, but I won't do that." "You're going to break this cycle, Grace. You're going to have the opportunities I never had." "What about your opportunities? Don't you want anything for yourself?" Helen smiled sadly. "I had my opportunity. I had love with your father. That was my happiness. Now my purpose is you." As Grace progressed through secondary school, she became more self-conscious about her background. She stopped inviting classmates to visit, ashamed of her tiny room. She lied about what her mother did for work, saying she was a businesswoman instead of admitting she cleaned houses. Helen noticed the lies but said nothing. She understood. Teenage years are hard enough without the added burden of poverty and loss. When Grace was 17, a wealthy boy named Victor started showing interest in her. He was the son of a prominent businessman, handsome and popular, and his attention made Grace feel special for the first time in her life. Victor's family lived in a mansion in Ikoyi. When he invited Grace to visit, she was overwhelmed by the luxury: marble floors, crystal chandeliers, servants everywhere. It was a different universe from her small room. Victor's mother, Mrs. Okafor, was kind to Grace at first. "Victor tells me you're very intelligent," she said. "Top of your class. That's wonderful." But when she casually asked about Grace's family, and Grace hesitantly explained about her widowed mother, Mrs. Okafor's warmth cooled noticeably. A widow? How unfortunate. And what does your mother do? She works in domestic services. I see. Mrs. Okafor's tone became distant. Well, you're welcome to visit as Victor's friend. For now. The "for now" hung in the air like a threat. Grace understood. She was good enough to be Victor's friend, but not good enough to be anything more. Not with her background. Grace and Victor remained close through secondary school, but she never invited him to her home. She was terrified he'd see how she really lived and lose all respect for her. When it was time for university, Grace won another scholarship, this time to study law at the University of Lagos. Helen cried with joy when the acceptance letter arrived. "You did it, baby! You're going to be a lawyer! You're going to change our lives!" But university life was even more challenging. Grace's classmates were from elite families. They had credit cards, smartphones, and wardrobes full of designer clothes. Grace had one old phone her mother had saved for months to buy, and 3 outfits she rotated carefully. The shame intensified. Grace started avoiding conversations about family. When classmates invited her to expensive outings, she made excuses rather than admit she couldn't afford it. And slowly, painfully, she began to distance herself from her mother. Helen noticed. How could she not? Grace's visits home became less frequent. Her phone calls got shorter, and when they did speak, Grace seemed embarrassed, eager to end the conversation quickly. "Are you ashamed of me?" Helen asked one day during a rare visit. "No, Mama," Grace lied. "I'm just busy with studies." But Helen knew. She could see it in her daughter's eyes. The girl she'd sacrificed everything for was ashamed of the sacrifices. It hurt more than all the years of poverty combined. In her 3rd year of university, Grace started dating Victor again. He'd gone to university in London but had returned for a visit, and they'd reconnected. This time, the relationship got serious quickly. Victor proposed at the end of Grace's final year. She was 23 years old, about to graduate with a law degree, and marrying into one of Lagos's wealthiest families. It was everything she'd dreamed of, the final step in escaping her background. When Grace told her mother about the engagement, Helen was happy but cautious. "Have you told Victor's family about me? About our situation? They know you're a widow. Do they know I clean houses?" Grace hesitated. "I told them you work in domestic services. They don't need all the details, Mama." "Grace, you can't build a marriage on half-truths. They should know who I am, what I've done for you." "Mama, please. This is my chance at a better life. Don't ruin it." The words hung between them like a wall. Helen felt something break inside her chest. "I would never ruin anything for you," she said quietly. "I've spent 23 years making sure you had every chance at a better life. Then let me have this. Let me marry Victor without complications." "I'm not a complication, Grace. I'm your mother." But even as she said it, Helen could see she'd already lost. Her daughter was choosing a life that didn't include her. The wedding was planned for 6 months later. It would be a massive affair at Lagos's most expensive hotel, with 500 guests, a designer dress, and all the trappings of high society. Helen tried to be involved in the planning, but Grace kept her at arm's length. Victor's mother is handling most of it, Mama. It's complicated. You don't need to worry about it. But I'm your mother. I should be part of this. You will be at the wedding. Just let Mrs. Okafor handle the planning. She knows what she's doing. 3 months before the wedding, Helen went to visit Grace at her apartment. She'd saved money to buy fabric for a mother of the bride dress and wanted Grace's opinion on the colour. When she arrived at the upscale building where Grace now lived, courtesy of Victor's family, the security guard stopped her. "Who are you here to see?" "My daughter, Grace Mensah, apartment 4B. The guard made a call, spoke quietly, then turned to Helen with an uncomfortable expression. "Miss Grace says she's busy today. She'll call you later." Helen stood there, stunned. Her own daughter had turned her away at the door. She called Grace repeatedly over the next few days, but her calls went to voicemail. Finally, Grace sent a text. "Mama, I'm very busy with wedding preparations. I'll see you at the ceremony." Helen felt her world crumbling. But she told herself it was just stress. Grace would come around. On the wedding day, everything would be fine. She used her meagre savings to buy a beautiful outfit for the wedding. A simple but elegant dress in soft gold with a matching head wrap. She wanted to make her daughter proud, wanted to show the Okafor family that even a poor widow could carry herself with dignity. The wedding day arrived. Helen took public transport to the hotel, carrying the small gift she'd managed to buy, a silver photo frame with space for the couple's wedding photo. It wasn't much, but it was given with love. When she arrived at the hotel entrance, the magnificence took her breath away. There were flowers everywhere, luxury cars lined up, elegantly dressed guests streaming in. This was the world her daughter was entering. Helen approached the entrance, smiling nervously at the security guard checking invitations. "Good afternoon. I'm the bride's mother." The guard looked at his list. "Name? Helen Mensah." He scanned the list twice. "I don't see your name here. There must be a mistake. I'm Grace's mother, Grace Mensah, the bride." The guard spoke into his radio, then looked uncomfortable. A woman in a hotel uniform approached, holding an envelope. "Mrs. Mensah, this is for you." Helen opened the envelope with shaking hands. Inside was a note in Grace's handwriting. "Mama, I'm sorry. Victor's family doesn't think it's appropriate for you to attend the ceremony. They're concerned about appearances, about what their guests will think. I know this is hard, but please understand, this is important for my future. I'll come visit you after the honeymoon. Please don't make a scene." Helen read the note 3 times, unable to process the words. Her daughter, the child she'd sacrificed everything for, had uninvited her from the wedding. "Ma'am, I'm sorry," the hotel worker said gently, "but I have to ask you to leave." Helen stood there, frozen, as elegantly dressed guests walked past her into the hotel. She saw some of them glance at her with curiosity or pity. She was standing at the entrance in her best dress, clutching a small gift, being turned away from her own daughter's wedding. The humiliation was crushing, but worse than the humiliation was the heartbreak. After 23 years of sacrifice, of love, of working herself to exhaustion, she wasn't even worth a seat at her daughter's wedding. Helen turned to leave, tears streaming down her face, when a voice called out behind her, "Helen? Helen Mensah?" She turned to see an elderly man in an expensive suit approaching. His face was kind, but unfamiliar. "Yes? I'm Professor Adeyemi. I taught engineering at the University of Lagos. Your husband, Daniel, was one of my students." Helen's breath caught. "You knew Daniel?" "I did. He was brilliant. His death was a tremendous loss. I've thought about your family over the years, wondered what became of his widow and child." He looked at her tear-stained face, then at the hotel entrance. "This is your daughter's wedding?" Helen nodded, unable to speak. "And they've turned you away?" His expression darkened. "Unacceptable. Come with me." "Professor, I can't." "You can and you will. I'm a guest at this wedding. The groom's family invited me because his father and I do business together, and I insist that you accompany me as my guest." But Grace said, "I don't care what Grace said. You're her mother. You belong at this wedding more than anyone else in that room. Now, shall we?" He offered his arm, and Helen, still stunned, took it. They walked past the security guard, who looked confused but didn't dare stop them. The wedding ceremony was already in progress. The church section of the hotel ballroom was filled with 500 guests dressed in their finest. At the altar, Victor stood in a designer tuxedo beside Grace, who wore an elaborate white gown that probably cost more than Helen earned in 5 years. Professor Adeyemi led Helen to a seat near the back. She sat down shakily, her eyes fixed on her daughter, who hadn't yet noticed her presence. The ceremony proceeded. Grace and Victor exchanged vows. The pastor spoke about love and family and the importance of honoring those who raised you. Helen wondered if Grace felt any irony in those words. Then came the part where the pastor asked, "Who gives this bride to be married?" There was an awkward silence. Usually, the father speaks. But Grace had no father, and her mother had been excluded. Finally, Mrs. Okafor stood up. "The Okafor family welcomes Grace as our own. We give her to our son." Helen felt the words like a slap. The Okafor family? What about the Mensah family? What about the woman who'd actually raised Grace? Professor Adeyemi stood up. His voice carried across the silent room. "I object." 500 heads turned toward him. At the altar, Grace's face went pale as she finally saw her mother sitting beside the professor. "Professor Adeyemi," the pastor said, confused. "On what grounds?" "On the grounds that there's been a grave injustice here today. This bride has a mother who sacrificed everything to raise her, and that mother has been excluded from this ceremony." Mrs. Okafor stood up indignantly. "This is a private family matter. It became a public matter when you humiliated a widow at the entrance to her own daughter's wedding," Professor Adeyemi said firmly. He turned to address the entire crowd. "I knew this bride's father, Daniel Mensah. He was one of the most promising engineering students I ever taught. When he died 23 years ago, he left behind a young widow with nothing but debts and a baby on the way. That widow, Helen Mensah, raised their daughter alone, worked multiple jobs, lived in poverty so her child could have an education." He gestured to Helen, who wanted to sink into the floor as hundreds of eyes turned to her. Grace Mensah graduated top of her class in secondary school, won scholarships, excelled at university, and she did all of that because her mother sacrificed everything. Her comfort, her health, her own chances at happiness, everything went to her daughter. The room was completely silent. Grace was crying at the altar, but whether from shame or emotion, Helen couldn't tell. And today, Professor Adeyemi continued, that mother was told she was too embarrassing to attend her daughter's wedding, too poor, too shameful. She was turned away at the door like a beggar. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Some guests looked at Mrs. Okafor with disapproval. Others stared at Grace with shock. But here's what none of you know, the professor said. Here's what I discovered only by chance through old university records I was reviewing for a project. Daniel Mensah came from a very wealthy family. When he died, he left behind a substantial inheritance for his wife and future child. Helen's head snapped up. What? An inheritance that should have been claimed 23 years ago. But Helen never knew about it because Daniel's family hid it from her. They blamed her for his death, remember? So they concealed the inheritance. Let her believe she had nothing. Let her struggle in poverty when she should have been financially secure all along. The crowd erupted in shocked whispers. Helen felt dizzy. That's not possible. It is possible, and it's true. I have the documents. Daniel set up a trust before his death, standard practice for young married couples. When he died, the trust should have immediately transferred to you and your child. But his family, particularly his brother Joseph, concealed it. They've been managing that money for 23 years, using it for themselves, while you worked yourself to exhaustion. Helen couldn't breathe. All those years, all that suffering, and there had been money all along? Professor Adeyemi turned to Grace. Your mother lived in poverty not because she had to, but because she was robbed. And she did it with such grace and strength that she raised you to be successful anyway. She turned nothing into something. And this is how you repay her? By excluding her from your wedding because she's embarrassing? Grace was sobbing openly now. I didn't know about any of this. You didn't want to know, the professor said more gently. You were so busy being ashamed of your background that you never asked why your mother struggled so much. You never questioned why a widow with a university-educated husband had nothing. You just accepted the poverty and used it as a reason to be embarrassed. Helen stood up, her legs shaking. Grace? Her daughter looked at her, mascara running down her face. Mama, I'm so sorry. I was so wrong. I was so ashamed, and I shouldn't have been. I should have been proud. You gave me everything, and I treated you like you were nothing. Helen walked slowly toward the altar. The crowd parted for her. When she reached her daughter, she looked at her for a long moment. I've forgiven you 1,000 times before you even apologized, Helen said quietly, because that's what mothers do. But Grace, you need to understand something. Wealth doesn't determine worth. Poverty doesn't determine value. I was never embarrassing. I was never shameful. I was a mother who loved her child enough to sacrifice everything. And that should have been enough for you. It is enough. It's more than enough. Mama, please, can you forgive me? Helen opened her arms, and Grace fell into them, sobbing. The entire ballroom watched as mother and daughter held each other, years of distance crumbling in that embrace. Professor Adeyemi cleared his throat. There's more. I've already filed legal claims against Joseph Mensah and the rest of Daniel's family for fraud and embezzlement. The trust fund, with 23 years of accumulated interest, is worth approximately 50 million naira. It belongs to Helen and Grace, and I'll make sure they get every penny. Mrs. Okafor stepped forward, looking chastened. Mrs. Mensah, I owe you an apology. I judged you based on appearances, on wealth, on things that don't matter. You raised an extraordinary daughter under extraordinary circumstances. I was wrong to exclude you. Please, will you stay? Will you be part of this ceremony as you should have been from the beginning? Helen looked at the woman who deemed her too shameful to attend, then at her daughter, then at the hundreds of guests watching this drama unfold. I'll stay, she said quietly. Not because of the money, not because now you think I'm worthy, but because I came here for my daughter, and I'll always show up for my daughter, whether she wants me to or not. The ceremony was paused and restarted. This time, when the pastor asked who gives the bride, Helen stood up. I do, she said clearly. I give my daughter to this marriage with my blessing, my love, and my prayer that she never forgets where she came from or who helped her get here. The ceremony concluded with Helen sitting in the front row where she should have been all along. At the reception, guests who'd previously ignored her now wanted to meet her, to hear her story, to apologize for judging. Grace couldn't stop crying and apologizing. Mama, those years you suffered, that was my inheritance? You could have been comfortable? I could have been, Helen agreed. But I didn't know. And I survived anyway. I raised you anyway. Money would have made it easier, but it wouldn't have made me love you more. I already loved you with everything I had. I'm going to make this right. The inheritance is yours. You deserve it. We'll share it. You're about to start a marriage. You'll need security. But yes, I'll take my portion. Not because I need you to take care of me, but because it's mine by right. Your father left it for us, and we'll honor his memory by using it well. Over the following months, the legal case against Daniel's family proceeded. Joseph Mensah and his siblings were charged with fraud. The hidden trust fund was released to Helen and Grace. 50 million naira, enough to change their lives completely. Helen used part of her share to buy a proper house, not a mansion like the Okafors, but a comfortable home with a garden. She quit all her jobs and finally rested for the first time in 23 years. She also started a foundation to help young widows, providing them with financial support and legal advice so they wouldn't suffer as she had. Grace used her portion to start a law practice focused on women's rights and inheritance law. She became an advocate for widows' rights, fighting to change laws that allowed families to cheat widows out of their inheritance. And she made sure her mother was part of her life, not hidden away out of shame, but celebrated for her strength. On the first anniversary of the wedding, Grace hosted a small party. During the toast, she stood up with her mother beside her. Last year on my wedding day, I made the biggest mistake of my life, she told their guests. I was ashamed of my mother, ashamed of her poverty, her struggles, her sacrifices. I was so busy trying to fit into a world I thought was better that I couldn't see I was already part of the best family anyone could ask for. She turned to Helen. Mama, You raised me alone. You worked yourself to exhaustion. You went without so I could have, and I repaid you by trying to exclude you from my life. I will spend the rest of my days trying to make that up to you." Helen squeezed her daughter's hand. "You already have. By learning, by growing, by using your success to help others instead of hiding from where you came from. That's all I ever wanted. You wanted me to break the cycle, and I will, but not by forgetting where I came from, by honoring it, by making sure other daughters of widows have it easier than I did." Years later, people would talk about that infamous wedding, the ceremony that was interrupted, the secret inheritance revealed, the public reconciliation between mother and daughter. It became a cautionary tale about shame, about judging people based on wealth, about the dangers of forgetting who lifted you up. But for Helen, the real story was simpler. She'd loved her daughter through everything, through poverty and rejection, through shame and exclusion, and in the end, that love had been enough. Not because of the money they eventually got, not because of the public vindication, but because Grace had finally understood what Helen had always known, that a mother's love doesn't need wealth to be worthy, it just needs to be real. If this story touched your heart, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear this message. Because this story teaches us that poverty is not shameful, but forgetting those who sacrificed for you is. That appearances mean nothing compared to character. That the people we try hardest to hide are often the ones most worthy of celebration. Subscribe to Reality Folktales for more powerful stories about love, sacrifice, and the courage to honor those who raised us. And remember, your mother's worth isn't measured by her bank account. It's measured by her heart. Don't let shame or society make you forget the people who gave you everything.